All right, let's take a look at these articles about President Trump's newest tariffs. Looks like we're going back in time to some of his earlier trade wars, but with a few new twists this time.
It is interesting how these tariffs kind of tie into some of Trump's, well, core concerns, border security, the whole drug trafficking issue, and of course what he sees as other countries taking advantage of us in trade.
Okay, so let's break it all down. First, can you give us the rundown of what these tariffs are and who they target?
Sure. So on February 1st, 2025, Trump signed this executive order. It slaps tariffs on goods coming in from Canada, Mexico, and China. We're talking 25% on stuff from Canada and Mexico and 10% on anything from China. Oh, and there's a separate 10% tariff specifically on energy resources from Canada.
So basically, a lot of what we import just got a whole lot more expensive. But why? Why now? What's the official reason?
Well, officially, the executive order says it's all about combating illegal aliens and drugs, and they specifically call out fentanyl and say it's threatening American society. Trump also says Canada's not doing enough to stop the drugs flowing into the U.S. He even calls them very abusive when it comes to trade.
So it sounds like he's mixing national security with his concerns about trade. But doesn't blaming Canada for fentanyl seem a little misdirected?
Well, whether tariffs are effective at all against drug trafficking is definitely up for debate, but it is interesting that Trump is bringing up some of those familiar complaints about trade practices, things like manipulating currency.
Right. So it's like he's using tariffs to try to tackle all these issues at once. But let's dive into that a little bit. What does currency manipulation actually mean? And how would it affect someone, say, buying a new TV?
Okay, so imagine you're shopping for a TV. There's a high-quality American-made one for $500. But there's also a similar TV made in China that's only $400.
Okay.
Now, if China manipulates its currency to make their stuff cheaper, that Chinese TV could drop down to like $350. Even if the American TV is better quality, that price difference is pretty attractive.
Ah, I get it. It basically undercuts American businesses and makes it harder for them to compete. And I bet another one of Trump's complaints, dumping, works in a similar way, right?
Exactly. Dumping is when a country floods the market with super cheap goods. So cheap they're actually being sold for less than it costs to make them.
Wow.
And it's often done with help from the government in the form of subsidies. Think of it like one of those crazy flash sales, but it never ends.
Oh.
The goal is to basically drive the competition out of business. Like when we see all that cheap Chinese steel flooding the U.S. market, which hurts our own steel producers.
That makes sense. So we've talked about why these tariffs are happening. Now let's look at who stands to win and who might end up, well, losing out.
One group that's definitely happy about all this is the U.S. steel industry. Nucor Corp, the biggest steel producer in the U.S., has been pushing for these types of protections for a while. Their CEO, Topalian, actually came right out and endorsed these tariffs. He called them far-reaching and very broad.
He sounds pretty excited about it. But why is Nucor so gung-ho about these tariffs? Is it just about getting back at foreign competitors?
Well, they've been arguing that all these unfair practices, the dumping and stuff, have basically made it impossible for them to compete fairly. They believe these tariffs will finally level the playing field and protect American jobs in the steel industry.
I see. But wouldn't more expensive steel also hurt other businesses that rely on it? Like, what about construction or manufacturing? It seems like one industry winning could mean another one loses.
You've hit on a really important point there. These tariffs have a lot of potential ripple effects that are, well, kind of complicated, and they could reach pretty far. So while some industries like steel might do well, others could see their costs go up, they could become less competitive, maybe even see job losses. It's a tricky situation, a lot of unknowns.
Definitely. So how are other countries reacting to these tariffs? I'm guessing our trading partners aren't exactly throwing parties.
You're right. Both Mexico and Canada are pushing back pretty hard. The Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, actually called Trump's accusations about them and drug trafficking slander. And in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been encouraging Canadians to buy Canada. It's like a way to counteract the tariffs, support their own businesses.
So a call for some patriotic shopping, huh? That's interesting. I wonder if that'll actually change people's buying habits.
Yeah, it's a way to appeal to, well, national pride, I guess. And it could boost demand for their domestic products. And it kind of makes you think, for you listening out there, would you be more likely to check where something's made and choose Canadian products if you knew American tariffs were making them more expensive?
That's definitely something to think about. I
Yeah.
mean, these tariffs aren't just some abstract economic policy. They could actually change what we buy every day.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. We're already hearing talk about a potential trade war. Countries like Mexico and Canada and even some in Europe are already making lists of American goods that they could hit with their own tariffs.
Oh, trade war. Doesn't sound good. Didn't we see how messy that got during Trump's first term?
Yeah, those tariffs back and forth with China caused a lot of disruption. And this time, even the EU is getting ready to stand up for themselves. Their top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, has warned that Europe is an economic heavyweight and won't hesitate to fight back if they have to.
So we've got winners and losers and the possibility of a trade war. But what about the people in the Trump administration itself? Are they all on board with this?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Howard Lutnick, Trump's pick for Commerce Secretary, has some pretty strong opinions about tariffs. Some might even call them controversial.
Oh, tell me more. What's Lutnick's take?
So during his Senate confirmation, he said straight up that the idea tariffs cause inflation is nonsense. And get this, he actually pointed to India and China, both countries that have high tariffs, as proof that tariffs don't automatically mean higher prices.
That's a pretty bold statement, especially with how much we've been hearing about inflation lately. But isn't there evidence that tariffs can lead to higher prices, especially for people like us? I mean, if a company has to pay more for stuff from overseas because of tariffs, wouldn't they just charge us more to make up for it?
That's a valid point. A lot of economists do say that while the connection between tariffs and inflation isn't always so clear-cut, there's definitely a risk that tariffs can push prices up, at least in the short term. It depends on a few things, like what goods are being taxed, how much demand there is, and how companies change their prices.
So it's not as simple as Lutnick makes it sound. There's a lot more to consider. But it sounds like he's really confident that tariffs can change global trade in a way that benefits America.
Exactly. He says that the U.S. has been getting a bad deal in global trade and that we need to use tariffs as leverage to force other countries to be fair. He specifically called out Europe, saying they make it hard to sell American cars and beef over there.
I can imagine if you're a farmer or a rancher listening to that, you'd probably feel like someone's finally on your side.
Absolutely. It's a message that resonates with people who feel like globalization has left them behind and that the trade deals we have now aren't working for American workers and businesses.
So we've got some industries cheering, other countries not so happy, and some pretty interesting viewpoints coming from inside the Trump administration. It seems like things could get really interesting from here.
And this is just the start. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll look at what these tariffs could mean for the economy and what it all means for you. So stay tuned.
Looking forward to it. Okay, we're back and ready to dig into what all of this could actually mean. We've talked about why these tariffs are happening and who's involved. But the big question is, how could this impact everyday people like, our listeners?
These tariffs bring up some big questions about where globalization is headed. I mean, for years, we've been moving towards a more interconnected world. And now we're seeing this potential shift towards protectionism. Countries putting their own interests first, even if it means less global cooperation.
Okay, I think we need to break that down a little bit. What would that shift actually look like in the real world? What's the difference between a globalized system and one that's more protectionist?
Well, think about it like this. In a globalized system, countries trade with each other pretty freely. They each focus on what they're good at making or providing. And that usually leads to lower prices for everyone because there's more competition. Plus, you get access to a wider range of products. But in a protectionist system, countries put up barriers, like tariffs, to protect their own industries from competition from abroad.
So are these tariffs a sign that we're moving away from that free flow of goods towards an every country for itself kind of approach?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. It could be a sign of a bigger trend towards protectionism, which could have big consequences for everyone, people like you and me, businesses, the whole global economy.
Let's talk about those consequences. What are some of the downsides of this protectionist approach? Like, could it actually hit people's wallets?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most immediate impacts could be that imported goods just get more expensive. So if those tariffs get passed down to us, consumers, things like Canadian lumber, produce from Mexico, even those Chinese electronics we talked about could all cost more.
So that new TV I was thinking about buying might suddenly be out of my price range. What about other things? Groceries, clothes, cars? Could those be affected too?
It's definitely possible. It really depends on which products get targeted by tariffs and how companies react. For instance, if tariffs on produce from Mexico go up, your grocery bill might increase. Or you might see less variety at the store.
And it's not just about prices, is it? What about jobs? If companies here in the U.S. are suddenly paying more for materials they import, could that lead to layoffs or even factories shutting down?
That's a valid concern. Let's say a company depends on steel from Canada, and those tariffs make that steel way more expensive. Well, they might have to cut back on production, maybe even close down entirely. And that means people lose their jobs.
So it really is a double-edged sword. Some industries, like steel, might benefit, but others could really suffer. And it's not just businesses feeling the pressure. I imagine these tariffs are also putting a strain on our relationships with some of our closest allies, right?
Oh, for sure. Canada and Mexico aren't just trading partners, they're our neighbors. And they've made it very clear that they're not happy about this.
We talked about that Buy Canada campaign earlier. What are some other ways countries might respond to these tariffs?
Well, like we mentioned, there's always the risk of retaliation. Other countries could put their own tariffs on U.S. goods. It becomes this back and forth, a tit-for-tat trade war that could escalate really quickly and hurt everyone involved.
Sounds like a recipe for economic disaster. And wouldn't that make it even harder to work together on other big global issues, like climate change or cybersecurity?
That's a real concern. A trade war can damage trust and make it much harder for countries to cooperate on those kinds of shared challenges that need global solutions.
So we've got these potential economic and political downsides. But let's zoom back in on the people making these decisions. We talked about Trump's motivations, but what about someone like Howard Lutnick, the nominee for Commerce Secretary? He seems to be a big believer in tariffs.
Lutnick's views are definitely interesting. He's argued that tariffs are a necessary tool to level the playing field in international trade and that we shouldn't worry so much about them causing inflation. He even used countries like India and China, both with high tariffs, as examples to show that high tariffs don't automatically lead to runaway inflation.
But haven't other economists said that while tariffs might work in some very specific cases, they can also lead to higher prices for consumers, hurt businesses that need to import things, and ultimately slow down economic growth?
Yeah, there's a lot of debate among economists about the overall impact of tariffs. Some argue they can be effective in protecting certain industries or tackling unfair trade practices, but only if they're very carefully targeted. Others warn that tariffs can backfire, leading to higher costs, less competition, and slower economic growth.
So it's not a simple issue. It sounds like there's a lot more nuance than either side of the argument usually admits. There are potential benefits and drawbacks to tariffs, and the actual outcome depends on a whole lot of factors.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that economics is rarely a black and white issue. There can be unintended consequences, ripple effects that are hard to predict.
So for everyone listening, it's really important to look at this issue critically. Don't just take any one side's word for it. Do your own research, consider different viewpoints, and think about how these tariffs might impact your own life and the economy as a whole.
Couldn't agree more. It's especially important these days when we're constantly being bombarded with information from all sides. Being able to critically evaluate that information and form your own informed opinions is essential.
So we've talked about the downsides, the political tension, all the economic complexities. But is there any chance these tariffs could actually lead to something good? Could they be used as leverage to get better trade deals?
It's definitely possible. Some people think Trump is using these tariffs as a bargaining chip, a way to get other countries to negotiate and make concessions that benefit American businesses and workers.
So it's like a high-stakes poker game. He's raising the stakes, seeing if anyone else will back down first to avoid a full-blown trade war.
You got it. And if that strategy works, he could get better access to foreign markets for American companies, changes to currency policies, or other concessions that he sees as making trade fairer.
But even if those negotiations work out, wouldn't there still be damage? Wouldn't it hurt trust and make it harder to cooperate in the future?
That's the tough part about the America First approach. It can lead to some benefits in the short term, but it might damage relationships and global stability in the long run. It's a gamble, and it's hard to say for sure how it'll all play out.
So we've got a few different scenarios. A permanent shift towards protectionism, a damaging trade war, or this high-stakes negotiation that could change how global trade works. It's a lot to take in. So for our listeners, what does this all mean for them? How can they navigate all this uncertainty?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed and think for yourself. Pay attention to how these tariffs affect the prices of things you buy all the time. Are you paying more for groceries? Is that new car you wanted suddenly too expensive? You need to understand how these policies affect you personally.
It's easy to get lost in all the abstract talk about trade policy, but we can't forget that this stuff has real consequences for our lives.
Exactly. And we're not powerless. As consumers, we have choices. We can decide where we spend our money, support businesses that share our values, and speak up for policies that promote fair and sustainable trade.
That's a good point. We're not just sitting on the sidelines watching all of this happen. We can make our voices heard and have a real impact on these policies.
And practically speaking, it's always a good idea to spread your investments around, just in case. Diversify. If certain industries or countries get hit hard by these tariffs, having a balanced portfolio can help protect you.
So it's all about being prepared and being able to adapt to whatever happens. And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with one last question to think about. If this trend towards protectionism keeps going and global trade shrinks, what could that mean for the future of globalization? Could we see a shift towards more localized economies, more regional trade?
That's a really interesting question. It's certainly a possibility. And it would be a big change from the interconnected world we live in now. We might see more local manufacturing, shorter supply chains, and a bigger focus on regional trade deals.
It's a world where Made in America could become even more important, a future with both potential upsides and downsides.
And it's a future that we, as informed citizens, have a role in shaping. So stay curious, stay engaged, and pay attention to where your stuff comes from.
All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive on these 2025 tariffs. We've covered a lot of ground, from the reasons behind them to who might benefit and who might get hurt.
Yeah, we've really dug into the economics, the politics, and how this all fits into the bigger picture of global trade.
So now let's try to look ahead. What are some of the possible outcomes of all this? Where could things go from here?
Well, one scenario is that these tariffs just become, a permanent part of the landscape.
That would be a pretty big change, wouldn't it? What would that say about where U.S. trade policy is headed?
It would really solidify this move towards protectionism that we've been talking about. It would signal that the U.S. is putting its own interests first, even if it shakes things up globally and causes friction with allies.
But wouldn't that risk alienating important partners like Canada, Mexico, and the EU even more? And what about the chance of them retaliating? We've already heard that some countries are getting ready to put their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Yeah, definitely. A tit-for-tat trade war is a real possibility, and as we discussed earlier, that could spiral out of control pretty quickly. Higher prices, disruptions in supply chains, maybe even political instability. Nobody wins in that scenario.
So, not exactly a happy ending there. But is there a middle ground? Could these tariffs be a tactic, a way to force other countries to negotiate better trade deals?
That's another scenario to consider. Some experts think that's exactly what Trump is doing, using these tariffs as leverage to get concessions from other countries.
So it's a game of chicken, right?
Yeah.
He's raising the stakes, hoping other countries will blink first to avoid a full-blown trade war.
Exactly. And if it works, he could get better access to foreign markets for American companies, changes to currency policies, things like that. Things he sees as making trade more fair for the U.S.
But even if he gets those concessions, wouldn't there still be some damage? Wouldn't it hurt trust and make it harder for countries to work together down the road?
That's the tough part about America First. It can lead to some short-term wins, but it might come at the cost of long-term relationships and global stability. It's a gamble, and it's really hard to predict how it'll all turn out.
So we've got these different possibilities. A permanent shift towards protectionism, a damaging trade war, or this high-stakes negotiation that could reshape global trade. It's a lot to wrap your head around. For our listeners, what does all of this mean for them? How can they deal with all this uncertainty?
The best thing to do is stay informed and think critically. Pay attention to how these tariffs affect the prices of things you buy regularly. Are groceries getting more expensive? Did that new car you were looking at suddenly jump in price? It's important to understand how these policies are playing out in your own life.
It's easy to get lost in all the technical talk about trade, but we can't forget that this stuff has a real impact on our wallets.
Exactly, and we're not helpless. As consumers, we have choices. We can choose where we spend our money, support businesses that align with our values, and speed up for trade policies that we think are fair and sustainable.
That's a really important point. We're not just bystanders in all of this. We can make our voices heard and influence these policies.
And on a practical level, it's always a good idea to diversify your investments just in case. Spread your risk around. If certain industries or countries get hit hard by these tariffs, having a balanced portfolio can help protect you.
So it's about being prepared and being able to adapt no matter what happens. And as we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with one last question to think about. If this move towards protectionism continues and global trade shrinks, what could that mean for the future of globalization? Could we see a shift towards more localized, more regional economies?
That's a great question. It's definitely possible. It would be a big shift from the interconnected world we're used to. We might see a resurgence in local manufacturing, shorter supply chains, and more emphasis on regional trade deals.
It's a world where Made in America might take on a whole new meaning. It's a future with both potential benefits and challenges. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and gave you something to think about.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep exploring and keep learning.